The first about 3 years of my life, I lived a very happy, normal kind of life. And then in March of 39, when the Nazis annexed Austria to Germany, then everything changed, and it changed very suddenly. From that point on, everything seemed full of fear. You know, even if we were walking down a sidewalk, and if my mother saw a man in uniform, well, we'd have to go off into a side street or into a shop entrance. Didn't want to take a chance on being seen and spotted by any person in uniform. So the whole atmosphere of life changed and became fearful. By June of 1939, my father was already in England, and he had found a foster family for me to live with. My dad put this photograph of me in the ad that he placed in the newspapers. I'll show it to you. And I always carry this. When I talk to school kids, I always carry this photograph with me so that they can see it. That was in the ad, and you know, I guess I have to say, I think that's a really cute little kid, and I don't think I've ever seen a cuter little kid. Anyway, it worked, and there were several families that were willing to foster me. My mother had a lot to do to be able to get me on one of those trains that were part of a rescue mission called the Kindertransport mission. And Kindertransport is German for children's transportation. You know, on the one hand, a train trip is always an exciting thing for a little kid. But mostly I was frightened and worried. My mother put me on the train. My mother was very upset that she would then be all alone. My father and I would then both be in England, and I was worried for her. She told me later that the last thing I said to her before she put me up on the train was that she shouldn't worry, that I would get her an exit visa so she could come to England too. This is the suitcase that my mother packed for me. It doesn't have a handle anymore, but it had a few clothes and a few toys, and it's what I took with me from Austria to England. And then when my mother and father and I were reunited and came to the United States, I packed a few of my clothes, a couple of toys. In here also, I've had this suitcase ever since. It's a memento of a troubled time, but one in which I was very fortunate to come out of it alive, and not only alive, but with my parents alive also. Millions did not. Not all the Kindertransport kids were really lucky, but I sure was. The Walsh family, oh God, they were good to me. They were so kind, so loving. They just wanted another little kid in the family to love. There were 7 Walsh children, but most of them were grown up. When I got there, there were only two kids still. There was a 12-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl. And so they got another little kid to love, and they were very good to me. They were just as kind as they could be, and they gave me a really lovely trike for my birthday. I got there in June. My birthday was in December. They bought me this wonderful little tricycle. I loved it. They later that summer, in the summer, they took me with them on a holiday, a 2 weeks holiday down by the sea, and they just couldn't have been nicer to me. That's how it worked out that I wound up staying with the Walsh family for about a year and a half. When we came to this country, we got to this country in late 1940. So as a kid during the war, they didn't know a lot, and so I didn't know a lot. And then after they got more and more information, they shared some of it with me, but they didn't want to. I was still a fairly young child. They didn't want to traumatize me. But remember that a lot of the worst things about what happened in the Holocaust weren't really known until after the war was over. There was just so little information up until around 1944 about what was actually happening. Then more and more came out, and once the war was over, then the information came out about how horrible the Holocaust was. I don't feel guilty about surviving. It's not a reasonable or rational emotion to have. I got out through good fortune. Millions of others did not, through bad fortune. Just the way it was, or what I feel is this intense sorrow for the injustice, the cowardly actions of those who produced the Holocaust. And I feel an intense obligation to do whatever I can to prevent the kind of prejudice, the kind of bigotry and bias that is responsible for that kind of murder, from letting it flourish and thrive. And so I feel it's an obligation I have to those who died to speak out, to tell the story. So I did get more involved, and I got trained to speak to kids in schools and to civic organizations, and started going around and talking to them 5-6 times a year. Well, we're in an unfortunate time now in a lot of ways. And there are a number of countries, it's especially clear in Eastern Europe, that are shutting themselves off from any kind of connection to the bigotry and the prejudice and hatred that was responsible for the Holocaust. We find this kind of nationalism in countries everywhere now. Poland isn't the only one, but this new law in Poland is an especially clear and nasty example of this kind of nationalism that is going on. Essentially, it says you can be arrested and prosecuted for criminal activity if you say or write anything to indicate that during the Holocaust Poles were involved. Well, of course they were. The Nazis ran the show, but there were a lot of people in Poland, in Ukraine, in Romania, who assisted the Nazis. And the kind of anti-Semitism that was rampant throughout Europe before the war is still there. Perhaps not to the same extent, but whenever you have this sort of strong nationalist sentiment and thinking going on, you will find that people will target Jews and other people that seem in some way, or you think they are in some way, different. And this is what's going on in Poland. The Poles had nothing to do with it, says the new law. Well, it's nonsense. But if you say otherwise in Poland, you can be arrested and put on trial and imprisoned. We see the revival of this sort of bigotry and ultranationalism in spots in this country too. Look at what happened in Charlottesville. And if the government does not, as our government did not, take a strong stand against that kind of bigotry, well, I fear we're in for some very hard times around the world.